The Arecibo Array deep space array hung in the darkness between stars, a cathedral of sensors and receivers spanning 3 kilometers of silent vacuum. For 47 years, its 17,000 antennae had listened to the cosmos, cataloging the electromagnetic whispers of distant galaxies, the rhythmic pulses of neutron stars, and the background radiation echo of the universe's violent birth. In all that time, across petabytes of data sifted by algorithms of increasing sophistication, the array had never detected what its builders had truly hoped to find. Intelligent life beyond Earth remained a mathematical probability rather than an observed reality. The array drifted in its stable orbit around the sun's gravitational null point, its solar panels drinking in light from a star that appeared no larger than any other in the crowded sky. Banks of processors hummed with ceaseless analysis. Status lights blinked their patient rhythms in the darkness. And then, on an unremarkable Tuesday in the year 2241, Antenna Cluster 7 registered something that made the entire system pause its routine operations and flag an anomaly that had not occurred in nearly half a century of continuous observation. Dr. Marcus Chen had spent 19 years as the array's lead signal analyst, and in all that time, he had learned the particular patience that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence demanded. He was 63 years old, with gray hair cropped close to his skull and eyes that had grown accustomed to staring at data visualizations until patterns emerged from noise. His colleagues on Earth sometimes asked if the work was lonely, stationed on a habitat module attached to the array with only a rotating crew of 6 for company. Marcus always answered the same way. The universe was speaking constantly, in frequencies and wavelengths and mathematical harmonies, and his job was simply to listen well enough to understand. He had heard a great deal in 19 years, the death screams of stars collapsing into black holes, the gentle hum of hydrogen clouds larger than solar systems, the precise clockwork of pulsars marking time across the galaxy. But he had never heard anything like the signal that now filled his display, its waveform repeating with the unmistakable signature of deliberate construction, of pattern created by minds rather than natural forces. The signal had traveled 112 light-years from its origin point, a journey that had begun when Marcus's great-great-grandparents were children, and humanity still measured its presence in space by the handful of fragile stations orbiting Earth. It came from the direction of Kepler-442b, a super-Earth in the habitable zone of an orange dwarf star, a world that astronomers had long flagged as potentially capable of supporting life. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Prime numbers first, the universal calling card of intelligence. Then geometric constants, pi expressed to 40 decimal places in binary, the golden ratio, Euler's number, mathematical truths that any technological civilization would discover and recognize. And then something else, something that made Marcus's hands tremble as he worked through the decryption with the array's artificial intelligence. Embedded within the mathematical framework was a structure that could only be one thing, not random data, not astronomical coordinates, a message. Someone across the vast gulf of interstellar space was trying to say something, and they had been trying for over a century, waiting patiently for any civilization advanced enough to hear them and understand. It took 72 hours to decode the message, and when Marcus finally understood what it contained, he sat alone in the observation dome and stared at the stars until his eyes ached. The beings who had sent the signal called themselves the Keepers, though that was only Marcus's translation of a concept that had no direct human equivalent. They were old, older than humanity could easily comprehend. They had watched the galaxy for millions of years, cataloging the rise and fall of civilizations, the brief flickering of intelligence against the cosmic dark. They had seen species destroy themselves in nuclear fire or environmental collapse or wars fought with weapons beyond human imagination. And they had learned, across all those eons of observation, that intelligent life was fragile, precious, and almost always alone at the moment it needed help most. The message was not a greeting. It was not an invitation. It was a warning, precise and urgent and terrifying in its implications. Something was coming, the message said, something that had extinguished life on 100 worlds, and Earth lay directly in its path with perhaps 2 centuries to prepare for what could not be stopped, only survived. The Keepers called it the Drift, and the images they included in their message were worse than anything Marcus had imagined in his darkest contemplations of cosmic horror. It was not a species or an empire or even a force in any conventional sense. It was something stranger, a phenomenon that moved through the galaxy at a fraction of the speed of light, absorbing matter and energy as it traveled, leaving behind only cold and silence and the scattered remains of worlds that had once teemed with life. No civilization the Keepers had observed had ever stopped the drift. Some had tried to fight it, marshaling technologies far beyond anything humanity possessed, and they had been consumed like all the others. Some had tried to flee, launching generation ships toward distant stars, only to find that the drift moved faster than their vessels and caught them in the darkness between systems. But some, the Keepers noted with careful precision, had survived. Not by fighting, not by fleeing, but by hiding. By making their worlds invisible to whatever senses the drift used to locate life. By going silent and dark and waiting for centuries until the drift passed and moved on to other regions of the galaxy. The technology to accomplish this was included in the message. The Keepers had been sending it for 100,000 years to every world they detected that might be capable of receiving it. Marcus transmitted his findings to Earth and waited the 23 minutes for his signal to arrive, then another 23 for any response to reach him. The response, when it came, was not from the scientific community or any governmental authority. It was an automated acknowledgement that his transmission had been received and flagged for priority analysis. He would learn later that his report had triggered cascading protocols across a dozen agencies, that emergency meetings had been called in capitals around the world, that the leaders of humanity were grappling with information that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their place in the universe. But in that moment, Marcus felt only the crushing weight of being the first to know. He thought about his daughter on Earth, about his grandchildren who had never been to space, about the billions of humans going about their daily lives with no idea that their world had just received an expiration date. 200 years, perhaps less if the Keeper's calculations were imprecise. Long enough for Marcus to live out his remaining years in peace, not long enough for humanity to develop the technology it would need on its own. The Keepers had given them a gift. Now the question was whether humanity was wise enough to use it. The news broke 3 days later, carefully managed through coordinated governmental releases designed to prevent panic. It did not entirely succeed. Markets crashed, religions fractured and reformed, and for several weeks it seemed possible that humanity might tear itself apart before the drift ever arrived. But then something remarkable began to happen, something that Marcus watched from his distant vantage point with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The nations of Earth, for the first time in their contentious history, began to truly cooperate. The technology included in the Keeper's message was shared freely across every border. Resources that had been hoarded were pooled toward common purpose. Scientists who had spent careers in competition began to collaborate with former rivals, united by a threat that made their old disputes seem petty beyond measure. The project was given a name: Silent Earth. Its goal was simple to state and monumentally difficult to achieve. Within 200 years, humanity would need to master technologies for which they currently had no theoretical framework, and then deploy those technologies on a planetary scale. They would need to make Earth invisible to the drift while still maintaining a civilization capable of surviving centuries in hiding. It was, by any rational measure, impossible. But then, Marcus reflected, so was a message traveling 112 light-years across the void to warn strangers of approaching doom. Impossible things happened. You just had to be prepared to recognize them when they did. Marcus stayed at the Array for another 5 years, training his replacements and helping to refine the Keeper's technology for human use. The work was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The hiding system operated on principles that bent the very nature of space and time, creating a bubble around a planet that made it effectively non-existent to external observation. Light passed through without interaction. Gravity waves propagated as if the mass was not there. Even the subtle electromagnetic signatures of a technological civilization would be swallowed and nullified. From the outside, Earth would simply vanish, replaced by a pocket of ordinary empty space indistinguishable from the void between stars. The first small-scale tests were conducted on asteroids, and they worked exactly as the Keepers had promised. An asteroid the size of a mountain blinked out of existence, invisible to every sensor humanity possessed, only to reappear when the field was deactivated. The asteroid was unchanged, its rotation and temperature and composition exactly as they had been before. Inside the bubble, time had passed normally. It was not death, not stasis, not some form of cosmic hibernation. It was simply invisibility on a scale that humans had never imagined possible. Inside the bubble, life could continue. Civilizations could develop. Centuries could pass while the drift swept through and found nothing worth consuming. When Marcus finally returned to Earth at the age of 68, he barely recognized the world he had left. Every city bore the marks of transformation. Construction stretched toward the sky and burrowed deep underground, preparing infrastructure that would need to sustain humanity through an uncertain period of isolation. Schools taught new curricula focused on the technologies and social structures needed for survival. Children learned about the drift the way previous generations had learned about climate change or nuclear war, as an existential challenge that could be overcome through collective action and careful planning. His daughter met him at the spaceport, grayer now, with lines around her eyes that had not been there when he left. His grandchildren, who had been toddlers during his departure, were now teenagers studying engineering and biology, determined to contribute to the great work. They did not treat him as a hero, and Marcus was grateful for that. He was simply a man who had been in the right place to receive a message, and who had done his small part to ensure that the message was heard. The real heroes, he knew, would be the generations that came after, the ones who would complete the work he had helped to begin, the ones who would shepherd humanity through its darkest passage and out the other side into whatever new dawn awaited. Marcus died at the age of 91 in a hospice overlooking the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by 3 generations of family who loved him. He did not live to see the completion of Silent Earth, which would take another 80 years, and the dedicated effort of billions of humans working in concert toward a single shared goal. But in his final months, he received one last communication from the Deep Space Array, a follow-up message from the Keepers that had taken over a century to arrive. They had detected humanity's response, the test activations, the planetary preparations. They had seen that their warning had been received and understood, and embedded in that acknowledgement was something that Marcus had not expected: a list. Names, or what passed for names, of every civilization the Keepers had managed to save with their warnings across their million-year vigil. Over 4,000 entries, representing species and cultures beyond human imagination, all of them hidden somewhere in the vast galaxy, waiting in their bubbles of invisibility for the drift to pass. Humanity, the message confirmed, would soon join them, not as neighbors, not as allies in any conventional sense, but as fellow survivors of a universe that was far stranger and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. Marcus read the list once, then closed his eyes and let the tablet rest on his chest. 4,000 civilizations, 4,000 species that had received a warning across impossible distances and had chosen to trust it. 4,000 hopes, scattered like seeds across the darkness, waiting for a spring that would come eventually. Humanity would be the 4,001st. And that, Marcus thought as he drifted toward sleep for the final time, was a legacy worth carrying.